Um, Thank you, Brandon. I always like to see somebody more bullish than Sailor. I always doubt it's possible, but then I find a guy like him, and he's a man after my heart. I'm wildly bullish Bitcoin this year as well. And before I get started, I'm going to talk about mining, hence the mining rig up there. Run Saz Mining is the CEO and co-founder. But before I get into all that, I just want to say thank you to the organizers. I didn't realize until last night at the dinner that we had for the speakers that Rainier was picking up the slack from John. And so anyway, just wanted to give a shout out to you, Rainier, for pulling this together. One of my favorite conferences last year, and fun to be back here this year talking about what I love and am passionate about in the in the Bitcoin ecosystem, which is mining. And the mining situation here is one that I think most Bitcoiners think is optional, and I don't think it is. And I'm going to make a case here today that we all must be mining, not just need to or should be. And I have a unique background in that I've been 12 years out of the U.S. now as an expat, lived in 2 different countries, traveled 26, find myself more comfortable in Latin America at this point than the U.S. And across the world, when it comes to mining, I find that there's not been many folks that have come into mining and looked at it through a Bitcoiner's lens. And so I'm going to try to do that here today, look at it from a Bitcoiner's lens and talk through why we must mine. And getting to that point, I want to actually just lay some definitions, because these are definitions that I don't hear talked about frequently. And the first is the novel innovation of Bitcoin itself, which is actually 2. We know and love the decentralized ledger aspect, but when the first block was mined, that actually introduced a second novel innovation, which is a decentralized money printer. Now, just as we can send value across the planet, if I want to send money to India, Nepal, Iran right now to help the poor people there that are going through regime change, I can do that with the decentralized ledger in a permissionless way. In the exact same way, in a very cypherpunk way, as long as I have electricity and the right hardware, I can print my own Bitcoin. Mining introduced decentralized money printing, and that actually thwarts, in my opinion, the massive Achilles heel that we've had as a species with centralized money printing for the last 4,000 plus years, right? And so that's a second innovation from where I sit. Also, by way of definitions, I want to talk about what it means to be a Bitcoiner. There's not a common definition for this, but the one I like and I use is somebody who chooses to save in Bitcoin to build a better future. Now, somebody that chooses to save, I sort of implicitly think that means self-custody, but somebody that chooses to save in Bitcoin rather than fiat has passed the, the event horizon. Right? At that point, when you see Bitcoin as your money, your worldview actually shifts as well. And that's the point at which I think somebody becomes a Bitcoiner. Now, savings from my travels is a biological imperative more so than anything, right? Everywhere I've been, I see people saving for the same life experiences. And these roughly break down into housing, some way to protect ourselves and our families from the environment. Education, so a way that we can educate ourselves to produce value out in the economy or help our kids become educated so that they can when they leave the house. Marriage, so that we can have our community recognize that a couple is going to go off and start a family and, add and contribute to society through procreation. Retirement, so that we're not a burden on our kids in the future. We save. And then the last one is if we hit a speed bump. This is the one most people think of as kind of the first line of the progress towards having safety in our lives, right, is we need emergency savings. So when we save in Bitcoin, though, something transformative happens. And I think of this as hard savings because it's hard money, right? And when you're saving in fiat, whether you realize it or not, you have a low-level anxiety because you're on a hamster wheel, right? You're running because you're needing to keep your dollars and the purchasing value, and you're constantly figuring out what I can do with this money to create more money because you recognize the dollars are melting. But when you save in Bitcoin, you save on a hard foundation. And that hard foundation orients you to the future, fundamentally. And when you're oriented to the future, you have hope. And as you have hope and your future orientation, it leads to an extension of our time horizons and what we're looking at in the future. And I would argue that that aligns us with our better selves. So most people in this audience that I know recognize that we're more than our five senses. Whatever you want to call that other aspect of ourselves, it's timeless. And so the further that our time horizons extend, the more it aligns with our higher aspect. And that means that we can start to look into the future, protect future generations, and be actually at our best selves. That's when you see civilizations thrive, is when they're looking for future generations. So a lot of very positives come out of hard savings. Now, how do we get that hard savings is pretty interesting, because there is a relatively unlooked at part of Bitcoin's history that is how we've gotten our Bitcoin. So if you were a Bitcoiner from circa 2010 to 2013 and you ran a node, you were also mining. There was no separation between mining Bitcoin and running a node. And so most Bitcoiners, if you meet them from that era, they have an affection for mining that doesn't exist with most Bitcoiners today. And that separation occurred because mining got difficult and the ASIC came about, and it became more difficult to mine than to buy. At the same time, Coinbase, whether you love them or hate them, they opened their doors the same year. So not only did it become harder to mine, it became easier to buy. The timeline split. And that's had some downstream consequences, which I do want to mention. So the unintended consequences is we now have a community that's largely buyers and miners, right? So just quick show of hands, how many people in this room are buying Bitcoin in whatever way you're buying it? Okay, that's most people. How many people are acquiring their Bitcoin by mining it? A couple hands, right? So just point being, there's a division. If I go to a mining conference, I find very few Bitcoiners. If you go to a mining conference, you will find, or if you go to a Bitcoin conference, you generally find very few miners. And this has created mining amnesia. And what I mean by that is most of the Bitcoin community, because they're buyers, they don't really understand mining in a experiential way. And so it's created a little bit of a boogeyman around mining that I don't think should exist. And there's also been mining centralization. I'll get to that in a whole other slide. That's a whole other can of worms, but it's a real issue. Why it happened, though, I think is really interesting. So I've already touched on the fact that there's convenience, right? It's easier to buy than it is to mine. And part of that convenience comes about because of mining community failure, right? So the mining community, nobody has shown up that's actually earned the trust of the Bitcoin community. And that's largely because the mining community is focused on self-mining instead of figuring out how do we get more people into mining. Third, there's just a fundamental supply and demand mismatch, right? If you've got a short time horizon and you want a lot of Bitcoin, you're going to want to buy it rather than mine it. Mining is a way to get Bitcoin over time. And then the last one that's often not mentioned is exchange competition. If fundamentally exchanges earn their revenues from taking a cut of the fiat to Bitcoin transaction, and that means they're in competition with the mining community that wants to sell you a different way to acquire Bitcoin. So mining centralization, I do want to touch on this because this is actually really fundamental. It's an issue that I think we all, unless you've had your head in the sand, you probably care about it to a lesser degree. But the fundamental problem that I see is the Bitcoin community has ceded the network to folks that are there to get more fiat. And the pubcos are the best example of this, right? The publicly traded mining companies, they have a fiduciary responsibility, a financial responsibility, and legal responsibility to return dollars to their investors, not Bitcoin. So by definition, they're using Bitcoin as a stepping stone to get more fiat. And this has unintended consequences because that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to stay aligned with their decision set for the Bitcoin network itself. So this can be seen in a couple of simple metrics. One is the mining pool hash rate has centralized. At this point, there's only two throats that need to be choked to actually create a double spend situation. We've got AMP pool and we've got Foundry with 44% of the hash rate. This was updated as of yesterday. And AMP pool actually has more hash rate than this because they have other mining pools that are proxies. So arguably these two represent an attack vector on the network itself. Second, Bitmain, who is also an owner of Antpool, owns like 70% of all the hardware that's being produced. Now, I don't want everybody to get overly pessimistic on this because the community is already working on these things and these numbers are starting to go the right direction, but these are fundamental problems. And they lead to why we need to mine, we must mine. And I'm gonna give 3 reasons for that. There's an economic reason, there's a moral reason, which I've touched a lot on already, and then there's a strategic reason. So the economic case, I find most people kind of get overwhelmed by all the numbers with mining. So I try to make it really simple. How much does it cost to run a mining rig each month, and how much do I get for that? If you do simple numbers, this is a current offering we've got in Ethiopia at a data center. It costs about $53,000 per Bitcoin that you're mining. Now, you're not mining an entire Bitcoin, but that simple fact, that energy cost of Bitcoin is not very well known. And I think if people understood that, they'd actually be more inclined to say, yeah, mining's actually accessible. Let me look into this because you're getting more sats for the dollar. Right? And then the second point I want to make is that those are wild sats, right? They're sats that are generated outside of the banking system. And what we see with our clients is they feel more comfortable to use them. I would actually argue mine sats are more likely to prime the circular economies than bot sats. Third is getting more sats for your dollar leads to a shorter time frame to stack yourself out of the fiat ecosystem, right? So that means there's time savings that you're going to gain in your life. The moral case, I've gone on this pretty heavy already, but alignment does matter. Having more of the Bitcoin community mining is going to strengthen our social layer, right? And it's going to make us care more about the network. And I would argue if most of the Bitcoin community had been mining, the centralization issues would not have occurred because the alignment of incentives would be there. Second, the network becomes less reliant on the fiat hashers. It's kind of natural flip side of that same coin. Third, the protocol becomes more decentralized. We've got more owners of the printing press. Fourth, the community becomes more unified, meaning this sort of division that we've got right now starts to fade into the distance. The last one's the strategic one, and I know that there's some disagreement on this, but I would say that our biology influences our psychology again, and we're driven by Gresham's law. If you don't know it, Gresham's law is to hoard the good money and to use the bad. It goes clear back to Roman times when the denarii was being clipped, the silver coin was, and the merchants on the street started to hoard the denarii in the cupboards and spend the bad one. And I would argue if you've ever had a moment's pause before spending your Bitcoin, this is why, is Gresham's law at work, right? And so that whether we like it or not, I think that creates a psychological friction and burden for us to use our Bitcoin right now. I don't think it'll always be this way. I'm very happy people are building medium of exchange solutions, but I do think this is the governing factor that we're dealing with right now. And as a result of this, the store of value use case is still being proven out. And actually, Brandon had a great slide kind of showing the same thing. This is the first cycle. Whether we're in a cycle or not, I guess is still a big question at the moment. But this is the first cycle to where we've actually seen the balance on exchanges going down as the price has gone up. That would suggest that people are hoarding the good money. And if you look at that as a percentage of global liquidity, it's very small. It takes a very small percentage of that 97 trillion to actually purchase all the Bitcoin. So when that starts to rush through and acquire it, and I agree with Brandon, there's going to come a point in time where that'll occur, we're going to have to transition from a buy phase to an earn phase. And mining is the easiest and best way to earn your Bitcoin. This picture here is the Milan Cathedral. I know I'm really segueing hard to go to a church picture here, but this has substantial significance for me because this chapel took 569 years to build. Can anybody in this room imagine us starting a project today that would take 600 years to complete? No, but it's Bitcoin. If we're going to be successful with Bitcoin, that's the time frame we have to have. So what does that take to do it? I don't know, but I think we should probably study the institutions that have survived that long to figure it out so we can get there. But what I know is that we're securing something that needs to last for the next several generations if we're truly here to care about the separation of money and state and moving past this Achilles heel that we've had with the centralized money printer. And part of that means we need to own the network and the means of production as the Bitcoin community. So I don't really care how you choose to acquire your Bitcoin through mining, but I care that you do. And, there's hash rate heaters out there that you can now get. There's bid axes, which has been a wonderful movement to see to educate the community. And SAS Mining, we've got a different approach. We're tied to the Bitcoin network genetically. It makes us a bit different than the traditional hosting model. So with us, if you wanted to get Bitcoin and larger scale than, say, a bidax or a hash rate heater, you would be able to buy a piece of hardware. We'd service it for you in one of our data centers, and we pass through the costs of hardware and electricity, and we take on the backside a 15% management fee. So we're non-custodial. The Bitcoin's sent from the mining pool. When it's sent, it's split. We get 15%. So that keeps us totally aligned with our clients. It also means that we're aligned with the network too. So that alignment of incentives has propelled a pretty good customer experience, I would argue. And that means that it's your Bitcoin. It's produced outside the system. It's software as a service applied to Bitcoin mining. I thought I had one more slide. No? So this is, I will say, Jeff, this is odd to have a quote from you on here, but you did inspire this business model. So I'd like to end this presentation with this great quote by Jeff. Bitcoin is hope, it's a bridge to the future, and we need to own that bridge. So, plug in a mining rig, turn it on, and stack yourself out of the fiat system. As Brandon said, I'm around if you want to talk to me, but thanks so much. I appreciate you guys all being here.